Hi, welcome to another live. Um, and I'm Yoni Ejo, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to a conversation with Keeley Craw, play therapist and friend of the group, who's going to talk about the effects of prenatal and intergenerational trauma. And as we know, a lot of adopted children and foster children experience trauma in many different contexts and ways. And obviously, their loss of their birth family is also a type of trauma. So, really interesting conversation. Um, I've sort of introduced you, but sorry about that. But, you want to introduce yourself, Keeley?
Yeah, hi folks. Yeah, as Johnny said, I'm Keeley Craw, and for a good 14 years now, I've worked as a child therapist. So in that time, I worked a lot with children in residential care and foster care, and in children in adoptive families. And then more recently, I have two children of my own, biological children, and I moved into setting up a private practice which focuses on supporting women who are struggling during pregnancy and in that postnatal period as well, making that transition to motherhood. So yeah, I guess that's where this kind of talk kind of goes, because I kind of hold the interest of the child because I've worked with children for so long, but I'm also holding the interests of the mom, and I'm also quite I'm not great at it, but I've got an interest in neuroscience. So I mean, I once professed to be good at it because it's such a big field now, and
Yeah.
I just sit there like just interested in what's kind of coming up. So
Okay. And for those who haven't come across me before, I'm uh, an adopter and an adopted person. I grew up transracially adopted, and I'm a social worker I've worked with children in care and foster carers and adopters for many years. So that's me. The floor is yours, Keeley. If you want
thanks
to
everybody.
enlighten us, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I hope it doesn't sound too bleak. So I'm aware, I live in Glasgow now, and it's nice and sunny here, and I believe in Manchester.
It
It's
is.
a nice day too. So I think we're in strong competition with the bottle of Chardonnay tonight. I think sat in the patio.
Well, fortunately, people can watch it when the sun comes down, and they can watch it later.
Yeah,
And
the weather's
it would it would be amazing if people just said hi in the chat so that we know that you're in, or if you're watching on the replay, do just say hi and let us know where you're watching from. That would be great.
yeah.
Okay, the floor
So
is yours.
tonight's talk really is like part two of a conversation I started with Yoni. We did that live, I think it was a couple of months ago now. Time's flying so fast, it's hard to kind of gauge how long it was. But we were looking then just about, in our initial talk, the first talk about kind of how like parental representations of the baby before it's born, so what they believe that the baby will be like, um, kind of affects the baby. And we're also looking at like neuroscience about how the birthing parent's brain changes during pregnancy, and then how both the birthing parent and non-birthing parents' brains can change after birth of the baby to really accommodate like that the need to then be responsive to this like completely dependent new life, and how that can respond, how they can respond and care appropriately, and then the impact of that when it didn't happen. But tonight I wanted to kind of like look at depression in pregnancy, so antenatal depression, postnatal depression, so like parental mental health, and then the impact that can have on child development. And we'll also look as part of that into different kinds of two types of trauma that can impact that can transfer from parent to child. So it is a huge topic, and that's why we've really kind of split it into two. But I feel like, even if you're not like a biological parent yourself, maybe you're caring for children because you're a foster carer or you've adopted children, this information is still relevant because it gives you insights into your child's world and how some of the early challenges that they faced might still be continue to play out in their lives now, but it maybe helps you to kind of set a context of what your child had kind of experienced, in utero, and then when they were born. And I know some children are removed. There'll have to be like a pre-birth assessment, and the children will be placed into foster care straight away. But the start of this journey actually starts in utero, so the impact is being made while before the baby is even born, and then for some children it might be a year or two or more before they're taken into the care of a foster family or an adoptive family. So it's still kind of relevant now and just helps you to maybe get a greater understanding. So the studies put the figure around 12 to 20% of women being affected with anxiety and depression during pregnancy. That figure now is probably much higher in the last 15 months because of the pandemic. So I know postnatal depression is about, it wasn't a great figure anyway. It was, obsessively high anyway, but I know now it's at least another third of women now report suffering with postnatal depression. I've not found any for antenatal. There's maybe not been any done yet. But I would certainly anticipate if postnatal rates have gone up, and antenatal rates would have gone up too. And then, so, the rates are actually quite high. If you think about that, if you're taking the 1 in 20, that's like 1 in every 5 women are feeling anxious or depressed during pregnancy. And depression in the antenatal period, some studies have shown that it can be associated with depression, ADHD, low IQ scores, and behavioural difficulties in children. So, right from the outset, this can be having a real impact on children. And the studies also show that antenatal anxiety and depression can be a strong marker for depression in the postnatal period. So, that figure of like 12 to 20% then probably translates, quite a lot of those women will then move over into experiencing postnatal depression as well. So the numbers stay high. And really one of the ways that, all those kind of effects I talked about will be things that you'll see in the baby, obviously after birth. But the way that the baby's been impacted, during like its development in utero is that, they're affected by the hormones mainly. So obviously, as well as food and some medications, a lot of hormones can pass through the placenta from the mother to the baby. And one of those hormones that makes an impact is cortisol. In fact, cortisol has a lot to answer for. It can be helpful because it's the mixture of cortisol and adrenaline is what makes you like run and identify if you saw you were crossing the road and all of a sudden you saw like a really fast car heading towards you. They're the hormones that kick in to get you to run across the road. So they can be useful. So in times of stress, cortisol is released, but in pregnancy it's released into the mother's bodies, and then the enzyme. An enzyme which acts as a barrier that normally converts cortisol into cortisone can be compromised, and that means more cortisol, so more of the stress hormone, can then be passed through the placenta to the baby. So I'd like to be explicit there, just in case there is anybody who is currently carrying a baby or knows of someone who's carrying a baby. It has to be an overexposure to cortisol that can have an impact, because no one goes through 9 months of pregnancy without some level of stress. And I know I'm talking to a lot of women, just a lot of mums, everyone's like really worried about getting stressed in pregnancy because of the way it'll affect them. But it's only that a real overexposure. So these are like women who are like, really struggling with like anxiety, depression, maybe live in very stressful circumstances. The pandemic won't have helped, but it's overexposure to the cortisol that can then impact on the functioning of the placenta, and if the placenta isn't functioning, then there's like a higher chance, say, of like a preterm birth, or there can be other complications due to like the placenta not functioning correctly, that then can help impact on the health of the baby and the mom. But I want to just reiterate, that it is like overexposure to cortisol. It has to be really like flooding the system, but the regular kind of stress, and pregnancy can be stressful, but it's a really like, in more extreme cases that, but again, probably in the context of a lot of the children in your care, they may have well had like the moms who were experiencing like extreme stress and distress. They may be living in very difficult circumstances. They may be kind of dealing with a lot of mental health issues, a lot of past trauma that's kind of coming up. So that's why it's relevant here.
Is that one of the reasons why domestic violence is so damaging?
Yes, yeah, and I'll actually come on to that later because there's an interesting study about that. But it's interesting, isn't it? And I think it's also, I mean, actually, last week was Infant Mental Health Week, and this week has been Baby Communication Health Week. And I think, when we think about infant mental health, it's not from when the baby's born; it's from like when the baby's in utero, and it's getting that much more of an understanding now, actually, that like things can impact the baby before they're even born. And being like in a home where there's domestic violence, is a real risk. Not just physically, because women obviously can be attacked, and that can obviously that the baby's life is at risk there, but it's also the stress as well, and just kind of being in that environment, because babies can hear, and if they're hearing like very violent and aggressive interactions, that has an impact on the baby as well. So once the baby is born, and maybe the primary caregiver, is struggling with depression, then you're seeing that kind of play out in more visible ways. So that the caregiver may have like reduced responses to the infant's cries. And actually there's some scans of depressed moms that have shown that reduced activity in the emotional and social circuits of the brain in response to the baby's cries. So we spoke about 3 circuits last time: the reward circuit, the emotional circuit, and the social circuit, and they all adapt during pregnancy and in that postnatal period. But for mums struggling with depression, some of that circuitry isn't responding in the same way, and they're not kind of responding to the children, which then gives a very different message to the children. And I don't want to blame mums, because mums can't help it if they have postnatal depression, but it's just to show that kind of how it can impact on the parent-child relationship. And I have to say, like, with all the mums I've met so far who have struggled with postnatal depression, they've got it, and they may be kind of, can have reduced responses, but they also are trying really hard as well. They're really kind of like swimming upstream to try and do something differently and be there for the children. So I don't want to make moms feel like blame, like, and like the damage in the children. So actually, because it's baby communication this week, I was actually listening to a talk last night by a psychotherapist called Robin Balbirnie, and that was about baby communication. And again, this is me geeking out a bit on neuroscience. But he was talking about how the parent or the carer actually acts as an auxiliary brain for the baby until they're able to take over certain functions themselves. And I was like, God, no wonder being a parent's so exhausting. It's like you're trying to manage your own sleep-deprived brain, and you're having to act as a brain for, like, a baby, or if you've got twins, you've got for another 2 babies. But all that communication that the children are kind of getting from parents and carers, is what's actually helping to build the brain. It's actually building those pathways. It's actually helping them to learn. And what's interesting, in the first 2 years of life, there's a lot of development going on, and then the development keeps happening, but it kind of tails off. But there's processes that keep going on the time. So the brain's developing lots of neural kind of circuitry, and then it starts to prune some bits out that it doesn't fit, that aren't being used because it can't cope with all the circuits that it's made. So I guess it's like a rose bush or something, it's growing crazily, and then it's like you have to kind of come along and prune some of it to kind of give like energy back to the rose bush. This is the gardener in me coming out, by the way. So then there's enough energy to kind of sustain and keep the rose bush flowering well. So what that actually means, if you think about that for like a child, who's living in difficult circumstances, say they're not kind of being shown a lot of empathy, then it means that those empathy circuits are not being stimulated from birth. So when it comes to like a time where the brain's starting to prune stuff out, like that's helpful, that's not helpful, that's not being used so much. Maybe again, maybe that's like clearing out your wardrobe. I've not worn that for years. Put that to charity. And then it's like it will prune some of that circuitry away. So then the children will have difficulty trying to empathize. Now, that's not to say that they'll never kind of gain that again, but it just kind of, there's plasticity in the brain and there's always capacity to grow, but they're going to have to be in an environment that nurtures that capacity to empathize. So, it's really important. I just thought that was like a really valid point to make tonight, as you kind of engaging with your children, maybe some of them don't seem to be able to empathize or see things from other people's point of view, or maybe the social skills aren't great. It may be that there's some of the circuitry there is being reduced because it's not being kind of nurtured and encouraged and grown in the first place. But that's not to say that they can't do that, but it's just like maybe an area of focus. If you kind of see that's like an area where they're a bit lacking at the moment, you can help build those circuits back up again. So I'll move on a little bit just to talk about the impact of trauma. Now, I've practiced that on Google, like how to pronounce it. Radke, Radtke, et al. In 2011 showed epigenetic changes, and an epigenetic change is the way that, just the whole idea of it, to be honest, blows my mind, but it's the way the environment can change a person's genetic structure. So what they found in this particular study, and this kind of links in, Yoni, with what you were just asking, the mother that had experienced violence from a partner, those babies had shown changes in their DNA, particularly around stress, how the stress receptors worked, and then that was still showing up in their blood as adolescents. So it just shows that kind of, the way that we actually do need to take, domestic violence really seriously, when there's a pregnant woman, not just about her physical safety, but also about the long-term impact it can have on the unborn child. We know there's like a lot of impact on when children are witnessing violence, but it's actually impacting on unborn babies too. So again, that's maybe something for you to consider if that's part of your child history. Is that the impact of that domestic violence, will be felt and shown in their DNA. So there's a lot of research now coming to the fore, particularly in Scotland. I think like before the pandemic, like there was a lot of kind of different kind of teaching and kind of care professionals getting really interested in ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. We've had there's been a couple of really big conferences in Glasgow, and everyone's really starting to kind of take on board that these adverse experiences. So normally there's a set of 10 of them, and then some of them are like physical abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to domestic violence, parents who divorced, I think is one of them. There's about 10, so people can go through, maybe have an ACEs score of 1 to 10, and the more ACEs, the higher your ACEs score is, then the more impact it's likely to have on like areas of your health. I can't think of a direct one now, but it'd be something like, I'll give an example, but it's not correct. But for example, it'd be like if you've got like an ACEs score of 5 or above, so you've had 5 or more adverse experiences in childhood, you may be like something like 25% more likely to develop obesity or cancer or something. So again, this is about the way it's partly like the epigenetics of it, is how it's kind of playing out into like the future health of children. So there's all that kind of stuff about ACEs, shows how like a child's mental and physical health trajectory can actually be changed before they're born as well, not just when the child is born. And there's a lot of research now that supports the idea of what we call intergenerational trauma. And that's where trauma is passed on to a baby from a parent or a grandparent, and that might be done again through the epigenetics, or it might be something that's quite subconsciously or consciously done. And sometimes people aren't aware of actually what they've done, but it's passed on. It might be a trauma that one of their grandparents had, but it's carried on to the grandchild. Which is again, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Just to kind of see that, and it made me kind of wonder, like, what it's been like, say, for the impacts of like, my grandparents, the 2 grandfathers, like fought in the war, and a lot of grandparents would have been affected. What kind of traumas kind of get passed through, like to like people of like my generation. Just interesting to think about these things. There's also relational trauma, and that was defined by a lady called Mary Main. I think it was about the 1970s. And in this type of trauma, the infant is actually traumatized by the interaction with the parent, and that may occur because of intergenerational transmission. So the parents of that child may have been traumatized themselves as a child. I think typically it's like through neglectful treatment or abusive early care, and as parents, then they may then become emotionally abusive to their infant or child. So the parents experience neglect or abuse themselves, and then they kind of pass that on, maybe like in emotionally abusive ways, maybe neglectful ways, because maybe they just don't know how to kind of like meet the needs of a child. But the impacts of that can be that it can impact on their attachment style and their ability to develop and their ability to regulate their emotions. So the child might present with like a disorganized attachment style. So that might look like they might make incomplete approaches to an adult, so they're not quite sure that, they might not be able to kind of fully kind of engage or ask for what they want with an adult because they're so unsure about, what response they'll get back from an adult. They may appear distant, they may be disassociative, and sometimes, if they've been in very painful situations, disassociations, a way that they can protect themselves, and they don't really kind of like seek out contact or comfort. So as babies, or young children, they may have like been really kind of distressed. They might have been really hungry, or they might have like a really wet or dirty nappy or something, but they're kind of afraid then to kind of cry out because they're, and ask for the help because, of the parents' kind of response. So then they kind of learn not to kind of ask for that help. They also may appear as pseudo-mature, so adapting too early, growing up too early, trying to do things for themselves at quite an early age. And they'll be working hard to please the parent, because if this parent is frightening, if they're emotionally abusive, and the child is always working to, for its own survival, it has to kind of be with an adult, because there's so much, they can't do. They rely on adults to do that. Then they're going to have to find ways to placate and please that parent so they can kind of get their survival needs met. So I'm kind of aware that we're talking about like depression and trauma, and actually, the conversation itself, and the kind of picture that it kind of paints for children actually sounds very bleak. But I think it really shows the importance, of acknowledging that infants and children do have mental health needs, and that we need to be responsive and warm in our communication with babies and children. And I think it also shows the importance of supporting parents and carers too, to help them understand and empower them to communicate well with infants and children, and just look at the importance of things of like supporting women, during pregnancy, to help them with that anxiety and depression, if they're in very difficult, living in very difficult circumstances, like a lot of distress, how can we support parents there? Because ultimately this impacts on, it impacts on the adult, but it's impacting on the child as well. And another interesting point I'll just throw in, I just remembered, is like, all this really affects a child's capacity to learn and to develop. Children can't, and we can't, to be honest, can we? No one can learn in a stressed environment. You can't learn anything new when you're stressed, because all you're focused on is just the stressor. So it's important that we're helping our children get to a place where they can kind of feel calm and relaxed and safe, and that way, that's how they will develop. And a great way to do that, I am biased, but it is true, is through play. So Yoni and I are actually running a course on a Tuesday night at the moment, which is about using play to develop relationships, because play is such an important, it's a totally underestimated tool, for helping children in all aspects of the development. But it's also a really great tool for helping children to develop relationships. So our course is focused on, we're working with lots of foster and adoptive parents at the moment, and teaching them how to use play to help them develop the relationships with the children, their care and their families. Because it's important for them to have those warm and loving interactions, and play is an important way to bring that warmth and joy and connection into the life. And maybe hopefully, well, not maybe hopefully, it would. I'm not gonna it can, it really can, change children's lives, and turn that ship around. So they may have started off, in really difficult circumstances, mom's been depressed while she's pregnant, they've been born into a chaotic, potentially dangerous situation, but play can turn that around. And yeah, I am actually convinced of that. So
Well, you've certainly convinced me of that in the time that I've worked with you. Is there an echo, Keeley?
I can't hear an echo.
That's all right then. I shall ignore it, because I can hear myself in my right ear. One of the things that I was going to say is that I think what's helpful for adopters and foster carers is to sort of remember and understand the context of children's behaviour, and how their behaviour has actually been a reaction to their environment. And I think sometimes that helps us really understand it, because in our households it's not an appropriate response, but where they come from, it might well have been a survival strategy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's how, it worked while they lived at home in, this chaotic or dangerous or neglectful or, whatever circumstance. That's what they had to do to get those needs met. And we only ever know what we know, don't we? That's why I always say, like, if you were from some like a very wealthy upper class kind of family, and you went hunting every weekend, that would be your norm. You only know what you know, and for these children, the circumstances they've lived in, they've had to do the very best just to try and survive, and those mechanisms maybe have worked there. But when they're taken out of the context of that, it's like, oh no, this doesn't work here, and then it looks, problematic, because and children, then just need to have to learn like a different way. I I think it's just important not to pathologize the child for that or punish them for it, because it's just, it's just what they knew. That's what they needed to do to get through the day.
Yeah,
It's us
absolutely.
us have
Kath-
to take a new way.
Catherine has asked, what will the child who's been neglected as a baby due to mum's chaotic lifestyle ever catch up with their peers, or will it affect them throughout their life?
I mean, I guess part of that, there's no like kind of cast iron answer on that, is there? But I guess some of the factors would be like, how long did they kind of live in that environment? So like, it might be that like, they were removed after 6 months, or after 3 years. So I guess that kind of plays a factor in it too. But I would say, the very first, the people often talk now about the first 1,001 days being like the most important to a baby's development. And actually, Robert Balbirnie was saying it's not the most important. It is like a formative time, but the brain is plastic. It's got this ability to change and grow all the time. So I think it's just like, if you put it in the right, if they're in the right environment and they're being nurtured, and you might have to put like a bit more input in. But children certainly have the ability to kind of catch up, with their peers. But it might just take a little bit of extra time. And if you can see areas where, there may be like some deficits, like around empathy, or, like language formation and stuff. It's just about, just giving them time, to do that. And I will say play is great for ticking both of those boxes as well, because, play is like, it's a really natural way for children to learn. In fact, now let me do this. And I probably won't get the absolute numbers right again, but I saw something the other day, and it was something like, it normally takes 200 times for someone to make a new neural pathway. So a neural pathway is like, you'll have a pathway in your brain on like how to make a cup of tea. So it's like, it's like a path in the brain that holds that kind of information. And the more it's kind of used, the deeper it kind of gets. A bit like if you were going to like keep walking through like a field of corn, you would make like a pathway, and the more you did it, like the deeper that pathway, the more defined that pathway would become. So it normally takes like about 200 times of doing that in your brain to learn something new. But if you do it through play, it only takes 10 to 20 times.
Oh wow!
So
I
I'm
didn't
like,
know
oh,
that.
yeah. So I'm like, that is why I just think play is just so underestimated. So if you're concerned about your child, I would look to like trying to kind of fill those areas where they need to be strengthened, trying to do it through play.
I think one of the other things, that having worked with a lot of young people who have had abuse and um, and ACE experiences in their early childhood, it's really important to name it and to give them some context, because I think sometimes social workers in particular, and sometimes adopters, are reluctant to say anything about what happened before, but the children know that something happened, but they might not have the words or the context for it.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think it's helpful.
Yeah, and then they fill in the blanks with their own story, which might not be correct. And often those stories are blaming themselves.
Yeah.
So those, the bits where they don't understand, where they think, well, it must have been my fault. And I think, Yoni, we talked about this not that long ago, didn't we? About that kind of whole culture of shame around being in foster or adoptive care. Just society, like sometimes people say terrible stuff, don't they? Like, biological parents is, if you don't behave, and you're going to go to the naughty children's home or something, and it's things like that, that when you are one of those children living in residential care, what does that mean? And it wasn't actually, their doing, that they ended up in residential care or foster care or adoptive care. It's just that, the parents didn't have the capacity to care for them. They love them, I'm sure, but they didn't have the capacity to care for them. But it leaves a real message with them, doesn't it? And they'll fill in them blanks
Definitely.
and So you're right, Yoni, it really is important to kind of acknowledge that. And there's so many different kind of books out these days as well, and different resources that if you weren't sure, there's other kind of resources that you can kind of use to kind of help scaffold that conversation with the child as well. But just to make sense of it can be really valuable to them.
Catherine was saying that that's good to hear that. Excuse me. What you've said. One of our fosterlings was removed after 3 months in Mum's chaotic life. She's 3 now and with a loving adoptive family. They've said that she still isn't where she should be, but I will suggest more play to them. Yeah, definitely. And it if you have a look on in some of the information that we're going to be sending out in over the next couple of months, just some ideas of activities and things that they can do with her, and child-led play is just really transformational. And not to blow our own trumpets too much, but some of the things that some of the carers who've done nearly the first half of the course have said it's really been transformational and made really sizable difference in terms of the relationship that they have with their children. So it's certainly worth pursuing, and spending a bit of time, one-to-one time with her, or encouraging the adopters to do so.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we always talk about, well, we probably talked about it a lot in like previous live sessions, but we talk about it in the training too, about how it doesn't always have to be like big complex things that you have to do to make the change. Sometimes it's just the small simple things that are maybe like consistently given to the child that make the difference. And that's certainly in the course. We're not asking people to do like super complex stuff and become like therapists or anything. We're just giving them some tools, but really the process is quite straightforward. But when done with consistency and repetition, it has like really like astounding impact.
No, you're very welcome, Catherine. I think we put a lot of pressure, and I know as a professional, sometimes professionals put a lot of pressure on carers to sort of do the right thing and always be a therapeutic parent. And while I'm not of the view that love is always enough, because I think that equally is not the right answer, but parents and carers can't always be on duty. They have to be. They can't be sort of therapeutic in a very sterile environment. They're parents as well, and parenting can be messy, and you will try something and something will work for one child and something it won't work for another child. So it's really about being open to learning, and trying lots of different strategies. And that's one of the things that I think has been so enjoyable about meeting so many carers is learning different ways of doing things and benefiting from lots of people's ideas. And I wish, certainly I wish I'd had the opportunity to talk about these things so much early on, because I don't think, even now, I don't think social workers um, and carers have the opportunity to talk about the mindfulness and the mental health side of things, and it impacts on so much of what children are able to do and how they can learn.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary amount of pressure on you as a parent if you feel like you've got to be this perfect therapeutic parent all the time. And I am an advocate for gentle parenting, and I do try my best, but I also kind of feel that children kind of need to see a bit kind of warts and all, because that's just part of being part of a family, and no one is perfect. Like you meet when you're old, when they're older and they meet someone and they fall in love. Of course, everyone's perfect then, aren't they? But at some point, the facade goes, the fluffy house coat comes out, and 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 if we're always like just trying to model like a kind of perfection all the time, what kind of template actually are we giving our
Mm,
children? They're not seeing like the fullness of humanness, and
mm,
sometimes you will fall out with each other, but there's a lot of learning in the kind of, in the repair and the making up of the relationship, learning how to negotiate, understanding that sometimes people can be a bit grumpy, you
yeah,
know,
yeah,
you know, otherwise when they go on to be parents, if they choose to do that, then you maybe have set the bar so high for them that you've like put a pressure on them. So I would say,
mm,
we are always like, aiming to be warm and make happy houses and have the children kind of feel connection. But I think also there's something that you just got to be quite real as well. And so I'm not advocating being
mm,
shotsy or anything, but sometimes you are going to be a little bit grumpy or distracted, or there's going to be like
yeah,
some of the behaviors that you find difficult and stuff. And I
mm,
just I'd let that just let some kind of just realness be in your life as
mm,
well, because that's what makes a real family. Um,
yeah. I one sort of story that had quite a big impact on me. My partner and I were in Ghana, and we were talking to one of her cousins who's an adult, a bit in his late 20s, I think. And my partner was talking to one of our girls about why she's got some illnesses and what medication she was taking. And I think Essie was about 5 at the time, and he was absolutely flabbergasted that she was talking in so much detail about herself and the medication. And he reflected back to us that actually his mum, who's now obviously he's an adult, she's an adult, would have never ever talked to him about anything like that. Um, and that he really, was quite impressed by and the fact that she could be so open and reflective of not being the perfect parent in that way, having foibles and humanity rather than being somebody who just doesn't reflect anything that isn't perfect.
mm,
Um, and
yeah,
yeah, that was quite quite a similar thing.
yeah. I think quite often, parents in the past have been taught that like they're the authority figure, and so they're always right, and they kind of keep stuff away from the child. But I think maybe more kind of modern way of parenting that maybe kind of is more reflective of what like research shows can be good parenting is more around cooperative parenting. So that there's definitely sometimes you've got to be the adult,
Mm,
and you've got to
yeah.
say no. We've got to do this way. You must hold my hand when we cross the road, or things like that. But there's other areas where we can
Mm,
maybe like both see the humanness of each other, but both have a more like a cooperative relationship and show
mm,
negotiation. And think how important that is for a
mm,
child who's witnessed a lot of like coercion in relationships, or has been coerced or physically abused, or groomed and sexually abused. Where adults' dominance has been put upon them, or that's all they've witnessed. What you
mm,
want, if they keep that template, of like the adult is always like the one in control, and you must always do what they say, and that they're never wrong.
mm,
They take that template with them too, don't they, into their own adulthood, into their own future relationships. Where if you can teach them about empathy and cooperation and negotiation,
mm,
which is developing the social skills, and just think what a nicer person they'll be in future relationships, or a good work colleague, they'll be, or a good
mm.
friend that they'll be, so, it's nice to model that and not, to have those old way templates.
That's a, that's a lovely message to end on. Thank you. As I think you've said some really important things. So about parenting, and I think it despite the subject that we're talking about, it's really hopeful, because I
Mhm.
think the message is that you can implement change and you can help children negotiate and navigate their way through life, coming to terms with their earlier experiences, but not letting them define them.
Mhm.
Um, so
Reconcile.
thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, and I look forward to another conversation in a few weeks' time. Thank
Likewise.
you, Keeley. Take
Thanks.
care.